All right, we're going to get started. Thank you, everyone, for coming to this panel. I know we have a lot of competition this afternoon. Some great discussions elsewhere. So I'm Max von Thun. I'm the director of Open Markets Institute Europe. For those of you who aren't familiar with our work, we're the European branch of a transatlantic think tank that researches the impact that market concentration, especially concentration in the tech sector, has on our economies and societies, and we work on developing policies to build a more open and diverse economy. And so with this panel, as the title suggests, we're going to talk about the latest big craze in the tech industry, AI agents. I think by now, most of us are familiar with chatbots like ChatGPT and Gemini that, for better or for worse, have burst into our lives and into our societies over the past couple of years. But the leading tech firms are already moving onto the next big thing, so-called AI agents that don't just give us information in response to queries, but also take actions on our behalf, from things like sending emails and booking appointments to buying our groceries and planning our holidays. For example, earlier this week, Google announced that it would be integrating AI agentic technologies across its suite of products, including search and Android. And companies like OpenAI, Anthropic, Microsoft are all moving in a similar direction. So, we need to remember that the technology underpinning these agents remains at an early stage, and the gap between what these tech firms claim agents will eventually do and what they can do right now still remains very big. So, we need to approach this with some healthy skepticism. But at the same time, I think we should be careful of dismissing this technology too lightly if it leads to us, as societies, as regulators, being caught unprepared. Today's dominant tech companies have penetrated so deeply into our digital lives that their technologies don't necessarily need to be transformative or even particularly useful for them to roll them out en masse, as we've seen with things like AI overviews and Microsoft Copilot, for example. But our discussion today will be less about the technical merits of AI agents and more about the risks that widespread adoption of these technologies could have for our societies. And as we are the Open Markets Institute, we want to focus in particular on the risk that AI agents come to be controlled by a small number of powerful gatekeepers, giving them potentially huge power over us as individuals and over our societies as a whole. And that could include the power to intermediate our interactions with businesses, with public services, with media content, with these agents potentially becoming the main gateway that we use to access the internet. Or as we put it in the title of this panel, they could become universal digital intermediaries. And this could even threaten the open internet itself if people, instead of visiting independent websites, do everything through these AI agents. And we're already seeing kind of precursors of this with the fall in traffic to publishers, for example, because of people relying more on chatbots to access information. And this kind of centralization of power around AI agents wouldn't be new. It would be simply deepening a trend towards market concentration that we've seen in digital markets over the past 2 decades. And I think most of us would agree the results of that have not been particularly good for our societies as a whole. I think the key difference with AI agents and with AI as a whole is that we still have time to try and steer the market in a more open, in a more competitive, democratic direction. Dust hasn't fully settled. I think there's still a little flux. And so we also in this discussion want to talk not just about the risks, but also the potential opportunities to steer this market and this technology in a better direction. So on that note, I would like to introduce our speakers, who are just the right people to talk you through these risks and opportunities. So I'll start with Udbav, who's sitting next to me. Udbav is the Vice President for Strategy and Global Affairs at Signal. Udbav's experience in the technology sector spans both global and regional contexts, where he was formerly the Director for Global Product Policy at Mozilla, and he also held roles at Google and the Center for the Internet and Society in India. So thanks for joining us, Udbav. Next to Udbav, we have Frederica. Frederica is a leading expert on the intersection of emerging technology, policy, and rights. And she's the founder of a consulting firm called New Possible, which seeks to shape emerging technology and digital policy in the public interest. And she's also a senior advisor to the AI Now Institute. Next, we have Ori Schwartz, who is the head of the competition division at the OECD, which I assume needs no introduction. and he oversees the OECD's work in promoting sound competition enforcement and pro-competitive regulatory policies. And then finally, we have Luca Aguzzoni, who is head of sector at DG Connect, where he enforces the Digital Markets Act, a key piece of EU digital regulation. He joined the Commission in 2014 and has also worked at the chief economist team of DG Comp and the Recovery and Resilience Task Force. So again, thank you all for being with us today. So let's jump into the discussion. And I want to start with Uri. So Uri, your team at the OECD has done a lot of work looking at the AI stack and specifically kind of market structures and competitive dynamics in that stack. So, how do you see the work that you've already done, the analysis that you've done applying to this, we could say, new layer of agentic technologies? And I think specifically, are you concerned about anti-competitive dynamics happening there? I think particularly because a lot of the companies developing these technologies have these big ecosystems that they can use to kind of self-preference their technologies.
Well, first, thank you very much for the invitation, Max. Very, very happy to be here. And indeed, we in the OECD have been doing a lot of work on digital in general, on generative AI and its implications on competition. And we should have a paper later this year that will focus on agentic AI and competition. And as perhaps to set the stage, I can offer a few possible ways of looking at things. First, maybe, you mentioned intermediation in your kind of opening comments. And indeed, agentic AI is an intermediation platform. You're going to go from A to B, and you're using agentic AI to get there. Now, as it is often the case with intermediation, it depends who does the intermediator work for. Does it work for you? Does it work for a third party? You can think, in this sense, perhaps there's nothing new there because a search engine is an intermediator. And again, it always depends when you're searching something on a search engine. It depends which interests are being taken into account when processing your search or when processing your request from your AI agent. And of course, in this sense, you can see how certain interests can play into this kind of complex relationship between you and your AI agent. A second way of looking at things, we've been talking a lot in recent years in the context of digital markets about ecosystems, about this competition policy. In traditional competition policy, we used to look at markets as kind of very isolated platforms. And we've been seeing that with the digital economy, this isolated views of markets is not so much relevant anymore. And we see a lot of aggregated products and services being sold, so to speak, or offered to consumers together. And in this sense, integrating another layer, which is agentic AI, might, again, repeat or intensify the same concerns that we've been seeing in digital markets in the past. Now, I should say, we know perhaps very little about agentic AI at this point. Needless to say, it has a lot of opportunities also for consumers, and there are good reasons why consumers prefer to consume these services through the ecosystems. And perhaps let me finish by suggesting what I think is the kind of ultimate dilemma that enforcers are currently facing, and perhaps we can hear from the enforcers around the table here, when it comes to new technologies, and especially such a potentially revolutionary technology. There's always this trade-off, when to intervene. If you intervene too early, then you might disrupt the market, you might undermine innovation, you might deprive society of all the benefits that come from such innovation. If you intervene too late, then markets might tip, and market power might be entrenched, and when you intervene, it might be too late. And intervention can be too late and too early at the same time. So this constant dilemma, and of course I should say, it's all about a technology which is still very much developing, and if you're listening to the tech people working on it, you might get very divergent views on where exactly it is going. So enforcers are facing really serious challenges in this context.
Great, thank you. No, I think that sets the scene really nicely for our discussion. And I'm glad you raised that point about whose interests do these agents actually represent. I think the companies would probably claim they're representing the consumer interest. I think there's good reasons to be skeptical about that. And again, I think that was, as you say, that has been a problem already. But when you have a technology actually taking actions on your behalf, buying things, for example, that I think question becomes even more acute. So, Luca, I want to come to you next. As I said, you are one of the officials working on enforcing the DMA, which is a crucial law when it comes to promoting fairness and contestability in digital markets. But we'll talk more about kind of how we address some of these risks later. But for now, I wanted to ask you a similar question to Ori in terms of sort of how are you looking at this obviously very nascent market? What do you think the competitive dynamics are, and do the gatekeepers have an unfair advantage here?
Thank you, Max, and it's a pleasure to be here together with this great panel and to speak to this numerous audience. So I will share some thoughts out of my enforcement activity. So I share the feeling that this is an incredible time for all those that care about the political economy of digital markets, because we are seeing all this dynamism in this area. So a few years ago, it was the moment of AI chatbot, as also was mentioned by Max. Now we see it is the moment of AI agent. If there is one lesson that we can learn out of the adoption of AI chatbot, is that this happens very fast, at least from the end user side. So in the past, we were used to have the technology adoption following S-shaped type of adoption. Now we are rather seeing exponential rates of adoption, and I believe that that is something that will likely apply also to AI agents. And now is a very dynamic space. We see all kinds of firms, small AI startup being present in that space, but also we see big tech incumbents present in the space. And I think there is this variety is a very important element to be preserved for a number of reasons, for giving more choice to consumers, for and also for preserving other values like democratic values. So that is something that I think should be central in our assessment. However, looking at the experience with the AI chatbot, we also can observe some other lessons that gatekeepers will not shy away from leveraging their current position to enter this market. For example, just to make a parallel with what we saw in the AI chatbot space, at the beginning there was ChatGPT. Alphabet with its own Bard was nowhere near ChatGPT in 2023, but fast forward a couple of years, they changed the name, they improved the technology, and now they are second close competitors to ChatGPT. Of course, that was due to a very great improvement of the product, but the question is also like to what extent the integration of Gemini with the other Alphabet products helped this process and helped this catching up. And these patterns are not patterns that are new, that we have observed only with the rise of AI technology. Are patterns that unfortunately we have seen repeating many times, especially in digital markets, because of some peculiarities of this market. So those are elements that should be central to the agenda of any enforcement authority. You asked about what are the advantages of gatekeepers today. I would probably describe two types of advantages. One set of advantages upstream, and then some advantages downstreams that can also explain why a big tech company would have an incentive to enter into this market. So starting from the upstream advantages, I see at least three layers of advantage. One is from an infrastructure point of view. So those gatekeepers that have access to high computing power or cloud storage, they have an advantage to enter into the space. There is an advantage from the distribution point of view, because if you are a gatekeeper of an operating system or an app that is used by 400 million people, you have an easy channel where you can distribute your new product. And lastly, the access to behavioral data. For agentic AI, behavioral data will be key. And to the extent that you can exploit all the behavioral data that you have collected from your other products, and you can port those into your new agentic AI model, then you have a clear advantage as compared to a new entrant into that space that do not have that accumulated advantage. And we have seen examples of leveraging those interdependencies. For example, we saw WhatsApp that integrated its Meta AI. At the same time, it stopped offering access to other AI agentic models to WhatsApp. There is an ongoing antitrust investigation there, so let's see what are the results. And so, like, we see that there is a repetition of this pattern that we have seen. Finally, talking about the downstream advantages, once a platform becomes an established agentic AI provider, then there are a number of downstream services that you can leverage and you can self-preference that provide also another advantage. And of course, those providers that are already active in payment system, or for example, they have other apps, they have social network, they have mapping apps, they can have their own agents self-preferencing all these apps, and so generating further revenue streams that can finance the deployment of AI agents. So to conclude, we see this space to be extremely dynamic now. There is, of course, the priority to maintain this level of dynamism. And as already pointed out, the big question is how to monitor this market and how to assess when and if there is a need to intervene on this market. And maybe I can say something more later in the discussion.
Great, thank you, Luca. I think you've set out really well the way that AI exists in this much broader, as you say, kind of ecosystem backdrop of concentrated market power in many different areas, right, from the infrastructure to the distribution. And I think that distribution point is really important because I think, especially when sort of generative AI was taking off, everyone was focusing on the models and the kind of inputs that you needed to develop competitive models, right? And I think now, as we're seeing sort of models become more similar in performance, actually these distribution advantages, like who can best get their AI application or chatbot or agent in front of the consumer, I think is now potentially becoming more important in actually determining who has power. So it'd be good to come back to that point. So Frederica, we've talked quite a lot about the kind of competition implications of agentic AI. But I'd like to broaden the discussion a bit to think about the broader societal implications of these technologies, again, especially if they are controlled by a very small number of players, and what this could mean, for example, for Europe's sovereignty, what it could mean for its security, what it could mean for its democracy, ultimately. So that's a big question, but would love to get your thoughts on that.
Thank you so much, Max. Ove and Luca elaborated on two familiar risks. On the one hand, we're already seeing that happening in front of us. Existing gatekeepers are leveraging their position in order to venture into agents, which could become the new intermediary between people and the digital world. So that is essentially a story that we know from the platform age. We've been debating this at this very conference for, I think, the last decade. But, and I really took away a lot from the Mozilla panel this morning on agents, it comes with transparency, accountability, privacy, and security risks that are exponentially higher from the very same players who have demonstrated over the last 10 years that they do not act as responsible intermediaries unless forced. So I think that is the obvious risks with agentic AI and the clearest link to market concentration. But I want to focus, especially since we widen the sort of like the perspective on sovereignty in a broader sense, I would like to focus on a slightly different dimension. And that has to do with the focus of my work the last few years, which is the relationship between the reality of the AI market, which is at once highly dynamic, but also deeply concentrated at every layer of the stack, and the way that Europe tries to shape this market via industrial policy. And these two often don't work together. And what I want to focus on is the dependency intensification. So agentic systems don't just create a new control choke point at the top of the stack, they could also massively intensify the dependencies at every single layer below. And the mechanism I want to highlight is inference. European policy discussions talk a lot about the compute needs for training large models, but we also need highly specialized compute for running them at scale, called inference. And what's interesting about agentic AI, I agree, we need a healthy skepticism. This is still a sales pitch. It is not a mass phenomenon. But if it were to become real, and I think Google's announcement this week points to the intention to do that, if agentic AI becomes the new paradigm, we're going to see a massive increase in the demand for inference compute. So if you think about what agents do, like a personal use case would be it checks your calendar, compares prices, sends confirmation. So each of these is an inference call, and all of this is routed through highly concentrated infrastructure. And this isn't speculative. We see how model providers like Anthropic famously limited access to OpenClaw. The pretext, or maybe the justification, was that inference computers, the requests are becoming too expensive. But this is the evidence that in a world of agentic AI, we need significantly more inference compute, which runs on highly specialized infrastructure that's controlled by hyperscalers. What's really interesting about this really hasn't been the focus of European AI industrial policy strategy that's focused on expanding compute capacity for training models, and that's focused on pushing AI adoption. So the key question really is, how does agentic AI map onto a stack that's already highly concentrated? And this market is forming, it's really in its early days, but there are three configurations that are emerging. So one, we see model and software scaffolding integrated. That's Anthropic with Claude Code. That's the clearest examples. The margins here are captured at the integrated layer with billions paid downstream to cloud providers. That's one model. We also see at the sort of extreme end of the spectrum, full vertical integration. Google is a good example, holds the model, the scaffolding, the infrastructure, and now also consumer-facing distribution. And then three, we have this sort of scenario that's often cited as the only opportunity that Europe has to be sovereign, and that is sort of like a scaffolding-driven commodification. So an idea where you have where the software scaffolding around the models allows you to choose flexibly between different models. And the argument is also, if compute is becoming more expensive, that could be the opportunity for smaller models, for open source models to become more prominently used. What's striking about all these sort of different, I would say these are current configuration. You could also say these are trajectories for where we are heading. What's striking about all of these is that all of them sit on top of this highly concentrated infrastructure. And as we saw a few weeks ago, it's not just that even if you have this open layer where you could switch between models, you're not just dependent on hyperscaler infrastructure, you're also dependent on access to models, and a company like Anthropic can just decide to turn this off. So what does all of this have to do with sovereignty? There are various contradictory definitions of sovereignty. I don't like the word, but what I do think matters is two things. One is, where does economic value creation happen in the long term? And the scenarios or the trajectories I've outlined are all scenarios where that does not primarily happen in Europe, and that is a problem. And the second one is sort of who shapes the future, who decides what our digital future looks like. We see increasing resistance against AI uses. And what I thought about when listening to your panel this morning was people use agentic AI in a context where they're pressured to use AI, where they're under immense pressure to keep their jobs and to be productive. So that is the context in which this is happening. And I want to end on commenting on something that you said, Ori. You said we have to be careful not to deprive consumers. And my counterpoint to this would be we're already deprived. There could be so many interesting, amazing applications of agentic AI run locally on small models in a secure way. Maybe you're skeptical of that. But that's not the reality of what this highly concentrated market will produce.
Great, thanks. I think your intervention also raises the question of, what's Europe's plan to address these infrastructural dependencies, right? We're all waiting for this tech sovereignty package, which has been delayed now and maybe delayed again. But I think, it'd be interesting to see if there's anything meaty in there. Okay, so Udbav, Signal have been very outspoken about the potential kind of privacy, cybersecurity risks from agentic AI, particularly when these technologies are controlled by dominant tech firms that have sweeping access to your device, to all of your online activity. So it'd be great if you could outline your concerns for us, and really if you can sort of make that link to concentrated market power. And I'm glad you got a warm up in your Mozilla panel this morning.
Thanks, Max. Thanks, Max. Can people hear me on the audio? Yeah. Okay, awesome. I think that it's quite important, even when maybe before I start talking about Signal's concerns and the ways that we see market concentration largely in the form of operating systems have a very material impact to the security and privacy promises we can make to our users. I'd like to talk a little bit about, I think, the definitional arbitrage that quite often takes place with agentic AI, and I think is only going to become more and more common as we see attempts to regulate it. And the reason I specifically call that out is because I think that there's a very real risk that when most people in this room talk about agentic AI, they can definitely say what it means for them, but very unlikely that what it means for them would also mean for a lot of other people. And the reasoning behind that is an agent can do many things, right? At the end of the day, it's a piece of software that can perform automated tasks for you either on your device or in ways that interact with other systems. So whether it's reviewing code on your computer, making sure that your files are arranged in the right order, that your music that you have is arranged properly so that it turns up well when you try to stream it on your personal server, all the way to booking flights for you, all the way to making decisions in autonomous manners. And I think that when we talk about agentic AI as Signal, we largely talk about agentic AI in the personal context, not necessarily in the more enterprise way where these systems are also being deployed and have, I think, just as much, if not more, market concentration concerns. So I'd like to just say that at the outset that there are many facets to which this argument and analysis could be applied to that I will not be covering. Tying that to Signal itself, Signal as the messaging application that hopefully most of you, if not all of you, use is ultimately an application that is dependent, I would say, on two main systemic barriers for people accessing it. The first are Play Stores. Currently, you need an iOS device or an Android device in order to be able to have a Signal account. Not necessarily Google Android device, but an Android device nevertheless. And what that means is that the policies that are set in these Play Stores and on these operating systems have a material impact as to what kinds of services and what kinds of features we can provide to our users. And what we started noticing about 18 months ago was that the same push around the AI hype cycle that was taking place publicly was also taking place in the design of these operating systems. What we started to see was that the easiest way to provide agentic capabilities is to open up interfaces in the operating system that then allow users to be able to pull information and context as easily as possible. And unfortunately, the paradigm we all collectively seem to have arrived at is giving the agent access to your computer, very similar to the user utilizing that computer. The way that they do it today is most of them ask for accessibility permissions, which were originally created in operating systems to let people use screen reader software and to enable people with different abilities to continue using technology and utilize those hooks to operate a computer on your behalf. The difference is that it operates a computer on your behalf probabilistically, which means that the harms that could occur from that operation can range from funny to very, very scary. For us personally, the first real material deployment, which I would even go so far as to argue is not really an entirely agentic system, was the way that Microsoft deployed Microsoft Recall. First announced it about 2 years ago and then actually deployed it about a year ago. What Microsoft Recall does is it takes a screenshot of your desktop screen on Windows every 3 to 5 seconds, stores it on device, and runs an on-device model that then runs an OCR, which is optical character recognition, on those screenshots. So when you type in, say, when was I looking at that photo of that yellow car, it will literally show the exact page that you were on when you were looking for which yellow car you wanted to buy. And the only mitigations at the point of release that Microsoft had incorporated in 2025 was private browsing windows were excluded, and it had a definition of what it considered sensitive data, including credit card information and social security numbers, that it would not store in this OCR database. What that meant was that anyone who utilized Signal and happened to be running the latest version of Windows 11 and had clicked on, continue in the setup screen would essentially have a screenshot of every single Signal message that they have received and interacted with permanently stored on their device until the user decided to delete it. And for those who don't understand what sets Signal apart in the ecosystem is that we take pride in collecting very little data about the communication itself. We don't know profile names, profile information, contacts, and a lot of other information that many of our peers and associated messengers do. So we suddenly went, because of the deployment of a single feature, from being one of the most private messaging services that you could use on Microsoft Windows to being just like any other messaging service that you could use on Microsoft Windows, because of the way that these agentic systems were designed, and most importantly, the way that they were perceiving information in order to perform the actions that they do. And what we ended up doing was tweaking Signal to use the same feature that Netflix and other providers use to prevent you from recording videos or movies or TV shows when you're watching them, to actually make the Signal screen invisible to the operating system itself. It's a form of digital rights management, and the fact that an open source tool has to use digital rights management is an irony that I don't think will be lost on many people in this room, but that was the only way. Even today, if you go to the official documentation around Microsoft Recall, you will see that that's the suggested solution. It's not, Microsoft still has not made any meaningful progress in trying to expand the scope of that sensitive information to include other pieces. So for example, India's digital ID project is the Aadhaar, and it will definitely screenshot your Aadhaar number. It won't screenshot your social security number, but it will screenshot the Aadhaar number. And that's just one example of the, I think, infinite varieties of sensitive data that it hasn't really been able to do meaningful things about. What that led to for us was a recognition and a realization that while this worked, it already had consequences. As when we launched this feature, we offered a way for you to be able to launch Signal with this feature disabled by default. But we got many requests from people who used to use Signal with screen readers because they were differently abled, that they were no longer able to use the software or the product because by default, we had to provide a protection against agents, but they had to go into the settings and tweak a switch to turn that protection off in order to actually be able to utilize that piece of software. And I think that's just one consequence of the fact that decisions that are made in these large vertically integrated tech ecosystems end up having ripple effects that, I've covered privacy, security, accessibility, competition, and lots of other fields as well, in a manner that it's not really, I think, very apparent on the face of it, but I think will end up being quite consequential the more and more that we deploy it. Maybe the final thing that I'll just say is that for us, we actually think that it's very, very important that developers, such as Signal, are able to exercise agency on behalf of their users when it comes to agentic systems. From everything that we've seen over the last 15 to 20 years, it's very clear that laws are not going to save us. I think if we wait for a law to prevent this kind of a deployment from taking place, we would have simply put the privacy of the millions of people who use Signal at risk in an unsustainable manner. And that we should have the ability to tell an operating system like Windows for Recall or Google on Android for Magic Q that this app is sensitive. Today, when you use your phone and you type in a password on a banking website, you will see that your keyboard looks a little different. And that's because the app tells the operating system, this person is typing input into a sensitive field, don't learn what the person is typing. So your keyboard doesn't keep just suggesting your password back to you whenever you go to the password field. So it's actually pretty intuitive and very simple to do. And we think that developers being able to do something like this is the most meaningful way to preserve privacy and agency in the short term. It's we call it battlefield medicine, while we wait for the longer, I think, deeper, more systemic interventions to take place.
Great, thanks. No, I think that's a really concrete example of how the rollout of these technologies could seriously undermine our privacy. And I think it shows that it's not science fiction, right? This is something that's already happening and is likely to happen much more in the future. So we've focused so far on the risks, but we also want to not leave you feeling too depressed. So we want to take the discussion in a positive direction. So we're now going to talk about the things we can do to prevent this market from being dominated by a small number of players and ensure that it serves the interests of people and society at large. So I'd like to come to you first, Frederica, on that note. So as we've discussed, these technologies and markets are developing rapidly, and it can seem like policymakers are always one step behind, whether that's because their tools are not fit for purpose or because I think, as Ori and Luca were alluding to, there's this nervousness about potentially intervening too early. At the same time, I think we're seeing a lot of determination, especially in Europe, to tackle the market power of these tech companies, not just from a competition perspective, but also in terms of, I know you said you don't like the word, but in terms of sort of strengthening the continent's economic sovereignty. So, my question here is at a high level, what do you see as the main levers for action here? Not just competition tools, but like more broadly, what can governments do quickly to mitigate some of these risks?
Well, there are two things that need to be done. One is urgently acting on mitigating risks that come with the symptoms of what we're seeing. This is focused on privacy, security, some of the recognition that Udbav laid out. So it should be, it's ridiculous that agents have sort of system level access to your device. That is, a security nightmare. And that is a high priority, and this is an urgent thing that needs to happen because these systems are being used and rolled out. In my own environment, I'm increasingly surrounded by people who run their business on agentic AI. It's like it may be sort of an early adopter thing, but agentic AI is real. Tackling the symptom also means really preventing and closely monitoring and acting on the kind of vertical integration that is forming in front of us. From a market concentration perspective. And then the more long-term one, which is more the focus of my work, is to engage in market shaping. It doesn't matter how you feel politically about market shaping. It makes certain people feel uncomfortable. But the reality is if we don't shape the market will be shaped by dominant players. But in order to shape the market, Europe needs to have a much better and much clearer vision of what we actually want, and a realistic perspective of where dependency is possible and desirable and where it is not. And the current strategy that we've observed over the last 3 years is a combination of, I mentioned it earlier, it's heavily investing in the ability to train models, which is great if you believe that this is the future. But if these models end up running on AWS, then this is not where the value is being created. And the other strategy has been pushing application, so pushing the adoption of AI, without really considering what the supply chain looks like. We now have hugely celebrated European startups. My favorite example is Lovable. It's a Swedish vibe coding startup that allows you to create websites and apps with text prompts. And this is a bit unfair, but essentially this company is an infrastructure wrapper. They rely on US models, they rely on US compute infrastructure, and from a sort of societal perspective, that raises questions about where value is being generated. But it's also a very precarious way of running a business because you're dependent on the very companies that are also your competitors. And Anthropic has, the company has learned a few weeks ago that Anthropic is thinking of releasing a product that is essentially a copy of what Lovable does. And just as a reminder, we've seen this before. We've seen this in the internet economy. We've seen this on app developers who are dependent on the App Store and it's arbitrarily changing rules. We've seen this from publishers who are dependent on Google traffic for their income. And we've also seen that the very companies who were dependent on Google traffic then suddenly got replaced once Google released the flight comparison site. So we're seeing a repetition of past competition dynamics that we urgently need to tackle.
Actually, just a quick follow-up to that for you. You were talking quite a lot about vertical integration and the advantages that gives, you know, the existing big players in AI. Thinking now about remedies, do you think we need to be considering some kind of structural measures here? For example, separating the control of infrastructure from AI agents or models, or separating AI from those distribution pathways? Is that something that should be on the table?
That's a good prompt. I forgot to add something, which is that, so while this is the direction of travel and the market structure suggests that this is what we're going to see, we still have to remind ourselves that this is a dynamic field and it's still evolving. And Europe does have the agency to shape how this market unfolds. And there are different levers. One is the inference economics. Do models have to be bundled with inference providers? Is a question that could be further explored. There are also lots of ways in which software scaffolding wraps around models, the protocols that surround it, the memory and context portability. So there are ways in which we can sort of shape this emergent ecosystem to be more open, to be more operable, and all of these are positive things. I'm just warning that they may not be enough as long as we're not tackling the high concentration at the compute level. And the answer is not building more compute, but the answer is shaping this market.
Yeah, I agree with that. So, Luca, I want to come back to the DMA, and I believe it was earlier this month. You published the first review of the DMA. Not you personally, as in, you know, the commission, which concluded that the DMA is fit for purpose in its current state, including in relation to dealing with some of these competitive questions in AI. And so, you know, with that in mind, I was wondering if you could give us your take on the potential role of the DMA in addressing some of the risks we've talked about here, and also, you know, related interventions. For example, you mentioned the Meta AI WhatsApp case, which is an antitrust case, but I think is very much about trying to prevent these future technologies from being controlled by gatekeepers. So your thoughts on that would be great.
Yeah, indeed, it's true that during the past year we've been reflecting a lot how the DMA can tackle the challenges that are presented by the emergence of these AI services. We have been doing so both in the context of the DMA review that Max mentioned, that we published just a month ago, but also as part of our continuous monitoring activity that we are doing of digital markets. And in this process, I think we have learned a lot talking with gatekeepers, talking with with independent developers, providers of these AI services that are trying to get access to the platforms controlled by gatekeeper. But also we learned a lot about AI services and their implication, talking with business users that are affected by these deployment of AI services. Like, for example, business users that typically were assessed by online search engine, and now they see their business at risk if the future gateways will be agents instead of being online search engine. And also we have been discussing with the consumers associations also to see the point of view of consumers. In the DMA, it's true that we do not have a AI service defined as such. Although we have a category that gets very close, that is the one of virtual assistant. We do not have any virtual assistant designated as of now, but this doesn't exclude that in the future there could be. But we also have many other core platform services, and to the extent that AI services are deployed in these other core platform services, they can already come under the scope of the DMA. Just to make an example, if there is a designated marketplace and this marketplace introduces a AI-powered shopping assistant, being that AI-powered shopping assistant part of the marketplace that is designated under the DMA, is already under the obligation that applies to that marketplace. So we think that from a designation point of view, the DMA has already the tools to capture AI services and also the nascent AI services that were not there when the DMA was coming into force and was discussed. We have also been reflecting about obligations that are applicable to AI services. We received also like a lot of input from the various consultation activity that we did. In terms of areas to pinpoint, I can mention that interoperability was one of the area of focus that was mentioned. Self-preferencing was another key obligation that was mentioned. Data access and data use, so having consumers being asked what they want to do with their data, if this data can be transferred to other services. And also cloud dependency was another area that was highlighted. To mention that in terms of the obligation, although the DMA prescribes already the obligation that applies to each service, in the DMA there are also some tools that without the need to reopen the regulation can allow the Commission to fine-tune the obligation that would apply to the services. And so there are some possibilities to modify certain obligation following a process. The DMA is already doing something for the AI services. For example, we have been discussing with gatekeepers about the setting of defaults that apply to AI services. But we have also started, and that is part of the regulatory dialogue that we are having with gatekeeper, but we have also started more formal enforcement actions. So in the area of cloud, we have 3 ongoing investigations for a possible designation of Azure and AWS as a gatekeeper under the DMA. And then we have another parallel investigation that is looking at whether we need to change certain obligation that applies to cloud services. And that is an example of the flexibility tools that I was mentioning before. So we are already using this tool to see whether the current obligation that applies to cloud are fit for purpose, or whether we need to do some changes in order to address the challenges that we are observing in the market. More closely to AI, we have launched at the beginning of the year 2 specification proceedings. One on opening up interoperability opportunities in Android systems. So Alphabet has deployed this Gemini on Android. We see that Gemini has privileged access to certain features of the operating system, and we want to open up those opportunities also to other independent players, and we are working with Alphabet to enable that. And then the other specification related to AI is the one on the sharing of the click and query data. We saw that AI chatbot, but also agentic AI, are heavily relying on online search to offer information to the users. And we have seen that controlling the space of online search can be also a key input for the success of AI chatbot and agentic AI. So with this specification, we are aiming to effectively share the data that Google is collecting in its own Google search with traditional online search engine, but also with AI chatbot that are providing online search. And so that is another formal action that we think will bring more opportunities for innovation in the AI space. On the WhatsApp investigation, that is something that we've been looking closely from a DMA perspective. There was antitrust action that were started, first in Italy, and now action followed also at the European level. I cannot really comment on that. We saw that some remedies were, or some changes in the policy were proposed by WhatsApp, and I will let my colleagues in DG Competition to deal with that matter. But of course, we are looking at it, and that is an example of the complementarities that there are between the various instruments. So when the DMA can intervene for what is specified under the DMA, that should be always the favored route. But when there are these areas in which antitrust can intervene because maybe are not directly covered by the DMA, then this complementarity is important. And in terms of objective of the DMA, just to conclude, the DMA has the tools in order to try to preserve this plurality that I was discussing before. And I think that maintaining this plurality can have, and opening up opportunity for many more players can drive innovation and also preserve choice for consumers and opportunities of fair access to this new technology for all those businesses that rely on those technologies to be discovered by users.
Great, thanks. That's a really useful overview of how the Commission is using the DMA. I think not just in already concentrated markets like search or app stores, but also in these more kind of emerging nascent markets to try and preserve competition in the first place. So Ori, I want to come back to you, and my question has kind of two parts. I think first was just what do you see as the most important interventions here? I think given your role really looking at all these different tools as a whole. And then secondly, the OECD plays quite a unique role in bringing together different governments, and in this case, different competition authorities to think about these problems. And when we're talking about AI agents, we're often talking about some of the most powerful corporations that we've ever seen historically. And so I think governments and authorities are more likely to be successful in solving these problems if they work together. So what do you see as the scope for multilateral or at least international action here?
Yes, thank you. Perhaps starting with the first part of the question and reflecting on what we just heard from Luca, if we take a step back and look at the kind of more global picture, even though we've had agentic AI with us for a couple of years now, the initial reaction and perhaps the risks that we've been discussing have been there from the beginning. The initial reaction of many jurisdictions was to focus on studies, research. And I think that's understandable, considering that, again, until recently, we didn't know what agentic AI is. And before taking action, many competition authorities thought they need to start with kind of researching the topic, better understanding it, and only then perhaps considering enforcement. And we've heard of several enforcement actions that the Commission is considering, but first, all of them are relatively new. And second, I would say that the Commission is relatively an outlier when you look at kind of the global picture. I don't see any other competition agency that has so many enforcement actions currently taking place. And the picture, that the WhatsApp case is a good example. It started in Italy, now it's in the European level. Brazil has at the moment a similar case, but there aren't many cases out there. We are now perhaps only at the beginning of kind of the shift, moving from research and studies to enforcement. And this is with agentic AI that, again, has been here for a couple of years. Just imagine how much it may take with newer technologies, like the one we're discussing here today. And again, considering that competition authorities are not tech experts, they need to learn and understand the topic before they can take enforcement action. This is understandable. Having said that, and going back to the second part of your question, we indeed in the OECD have been advocating for international cooperation in competition enforcement since the 1960s. This was the first time we had a kind of an international best practice on international cooperation in competition enforcement. And you rightfully mentioned that the gap in resources, which is, again, it's not new. Firms always had more resources than governments. But in the current age, this gap is widening and widening and widening. And again, pulling resources together can be certainly not the only solution, but a very meaningful solution. And just, again, going back a few years, it's kind of the more standard digital markets type of enforcement. How many competition authorities have been having, some of them still have enforcement actions aimed at Google search engine or the iPhone or Google EdTech or the Amazon platform. You look around the globe and you see cases which are very, very similar. Now, of course, legal obstacles exist, and you can always find good reasons not to cooperate, not to share information, not to work together. And I should say, especially in this more fragmented era in which we're living in the last, I would say, year or two. Having said that, I'm not sure that it makes sense to have so many different cases, similar cases in parallel. It makes much more sense to work much more closely together, to share experiences. I mean, competition authorities are doing that, mostly on an informal level, mostly kind of this kind of exchange of ideas, less so on a formal level, mostly more so on mergers and acquisition, less so when it comes to actual enforcement. So again, this is not the silver bullet, but this is certainly a bullet that can certainly be used.
And I had a quick follow-up to that. So you mentioned that the Commission is kind of an outlier in terms of doing these AI-related enforcement cases. You mentioned, one reason being that Commission authorities need time to get up to speed with the technology. But do you also think that there's a political explanation here in that, a lot of governments are making sort of AI adoption, AI acceleration part of their policy, the US official policy, sort of AI dominance. But even in the UK, there's a lot of emphasis, not from the competition authority, but from the government on AI rollout. And the chair of the CMA was actually sort of fired because he wasn't pro-growth enough. So do you also see that as part of the explanation for why maybe we're not seeing as much enforcement as we would expect?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, I don't think that governments are necessarily intervening in enforcement actions. The policy environment is indeed far more complex than it used to be. And yes, indeed, competition authorities are not as isolated as they used to be from the broader policy environment. And governments have, especially these days, many priorities. Some have to do with competition, others not so much. And this balancing act is a complicated one. And if a government decide, in a transparent manner that it prioritizes other values, other public interests instead of competition, to me, that's fair enough.
And now, Utbav, last but not least. So I want to talk a little bit about the potential there might be to sort of create alternatives to these kind of big tech dominated agents. So Signal obviously is a leading alternative to things like WhatsApp in messaging services. You also worked at Mozilla before, which is the equivalent for browsers. So when it comes to agents, sort of what steps can policymakers be taking to foster alternatives, given all the kind of market concentration and anti-competitive practices that we've been talking about?
Thank you. Maybe I'll start with saying that I think that the way that we, most of us have the same amount of maybe awe is the wrong word, but awe of the way that these AI models work for agents. But ultimately, I think agentic systems, when connected to a model, are unique or different because they have the specific ability to call tools and perform tasks that aren't just tasks that the model is performing, but tasks that the agent knows how to perform because the model is telling it to try it this way. So for example, for our Mozilla session earlier today, and Julia's here, but I wanted to make a backdrop, and in that backdrop, I wanted the backdrop was black in color, and I wanted the logos for each of the organizations to be white against that backdrop. So the Ada Lovelace Institute does not have on the public internet, as far as I know, a logo that is white in color. That's not their official color. And as an experiment, I decided to try all of the different like agents to see and ask it to like do this, which is make the logo black and white with the text itself being white. And in that, I think the reason I ultimately ended up going with the local model was because the local model on my computer looked up on the internet from the computer, which tool could be used to essentially inverse the color and make it white, and then downloaded the tool, ran the tool, converted the image into white, and then gave me the image in like 5 to 8 seconds. It did all of this very, very quickly. And I think that in order for it to do any of those things, we really don't need any of the massive like capabilities that we are currently talking about. I don't think you need the same model to do protein folding and to summarize your email. And the reality is that like it's makes sense for the overall hype cycle for it to be perceived that way, to say that this is all progress and the like same thing that's doing that is doing this for you. But I think the reality is that for the vast majority of our more day-to-day use cases, it's actually very possible for a lot of these softwares to be quite different from what they are right now. I used to be a lot more optimistic about the role that openly available model weights could play in this ecosystem. And the reason I'm less optimistic now has nothing to do with capability, but because of where those open model weights are coming from. I think that for all of the security and privacy risks that we regularly talk about when it comes to agentic AI, the fact that the top like 8 out of 10 models that do this well are all from labs that are largely based out of China has very serious implications for organizations that might want to deploy these things internally, or people who might want to deploy them in sensitive contexts as well. And I think that the reason that China has, as a part, like at least partially as a part, like industrial policy, decided to take that approach is because they know that they were not going to play the game on the rules that the American technology platforms were setting for them. Because if they did, then they access controls to chips and all of those other things would have meant that they would have never really been able to do that. So I do think that government should look very closely at ecosystems and figure out like what are the ways that you can incentivize some of these alternatives to exist beyond just funding and research. Procurement is a very powerful lens. Incentivizing design is a very powerful lens. I would say the entirety of the Global South has a lot of experience in building technologies based on open source software and principles in order to reduce costs for governments that I think in some parts of the world has led to the open source movement surviving in places where it would not have. And a lot of those learnings and lessons I think are quite deliberately being obfuscated as not being applicable to this scenario, when I think they're very, very directly applicable and have actually led to success in the past, but we aren't really seeing them now. I also think that secondly, in the existence of those alternatives, as long as we keep trying to pass laws to tell people how to write software, I think that the people who write the software will always win. And because one is limited by democracy and the other is limited by the whims of like a product manager. And the reason that distinction is like really, really important is because I think that like when we talk about, for example, self-preferencing, when we talk about like all of these competition principles, in the agentic world, I think it's really, really hard to say this is fair behavior and this is unfair behavior. And fair is if you're Google and you're building this, don't use any other Google software and it's fair, and everything else is unfair. And I think that the solution to that, though, is ultimately trying to standardize the interfaces upon which these interactions take place. So at a bare minimum, you can understand why what is happening, both as a regulator and as a consumer and a developer. But after you do that, I think it actually also helps in making sure that these things happen on much more fair and equitable bases than they are happening right now. We've already seen both Google and Apple, I think, like kind of start in the same place, then go differently, like from the conversations that and the consultation that the commission ran recently on allowing other models to run on Android devices, not just Gemini and Google provided models and those capabilities. The responses to that were fascinating for me personally, because I think you can already start seeing why the same arguments that were being made, like in the Microsoft case, like in the 1990s, are with sometimes not even being tweaked and directly being applied to the AI space. And on the face of it, it actually sounds like it makes sense. But the reality is that our primary problem with how these systems operate currently is understanding how they work and understanding what the consequences might be if they go wrong. And as long as we keep working towards addressing both of them, whether for security or privacy reasons or whether for competition, we will, I think, end up in a better place. But we are doing ourselves a disadvantage if we try to view these in like silos and say this is this regulator's responsibility and that is that country's responsibility, because the people who are making these softwares are making them in one place and then selling them to the world, and the world is then, you know, bisecting it and trying to like just solve a small part of the problem.
Yeah, absolutely agree on the need to break down silos in enforcement and regulation. So we have about 9 minutes left. So I do want to open it up to audience Q&A. So if you have a question, yeah, just put your hand up and then we'll try and come to you. Why don't we start with like 3 questions together? So are there mics?
Do you feel it's a David Goliath situation with big tech, or are you feeling the pressure for the enforcement?
Could you quickly say your name and role?
Peter Itkostic from the Open Mind Foundations that develops open source software.
Got it. 2 more. At the back.
There's only one mic.
Do you want to take it?
Maybe I can shout.
Just shout.
The DMA seems to me to be, so I was fascinated from there, the consumer organisation. The DMA seems to me to be an excellent tool to tackle the kind of anti-competitive practices that we're seeing in this area and that have harmed digital markets in the past. So I think the specifications proceedings that the Commission has launched recently are exactly what the DMA was designed to do, which is to have this ex ante regulation, these ex ante measures that can really nip those anti-competitive practices in the bud. My question is to Luca, and is regarding these specification proceedings that you've just closed the consultation on, whereas the DMA can tackle some of those anti-competitive practices that we are seeing, has there been a discussion in the high-level group, so between all the different authorities that are part of the high-level group of the DMA, to tackle the potential security issues, potential privacy issues, and if not, is there that mechanism to allow a sort of real cross-regulatory discussion to make sure that these specifications deliver the best possible outcome for markets, but also on privacy and on security? Thank you.
We can take one more.
Hi, Peter Swire. I'm a professor at Georgia Tech in the School of Cybersecurity and Privacy. This picks up a little bit on Ubdav's points about the role of standards. So if it's not going to be self-preferencing, if it's not going to be inside one company, then you're going to have multiple companies involved. And the standards could themselves become a topic of where monopoly power takes over. And so you want to have things like fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory standards. What's the governance way to get towards anything like those standards? It was barely mentioned by Ubdav. It wasn't mentioned too much beyond. It seems like if you're going to have a lot of players, you're going to need a lot of standards.
Do you want to start with that standards point?
Sure, happy to. I mean, I will first say that like the tech company has made a very fine art of leveraging standards and standardization processes to further entrench their market power. Whether it's what we are seeing happen with the Model Context Protocol and how it's moving to the Linux Foundation and the way that it's going to be governed there. Ultimately, most tech standards in the tech space are actually made by organizations that decide to invest the money and the power in order to make that happen. And then there are few exceptions, but because of how fundamentally compromised they are, I don't see a way where those standards, which will undoubtedly get created because it's in the interest of these enterprises for those standards to exist, can effectively have the public interest in mind unless the current, like the way that the board is currently laid completely changes. I think like I've been a part of initiatives that send people with some technical background to standardization bodies, and it's like 5 people versus 5,000 on the other side. So the way that it's actually been structured, even like at the top level in terms of how competition authorities and others look at standardization bodies, more often than not, I think they were set up for a time at which you like this kind of standards that you were coming up with were standards for, like rail tracks and things like that, which are quite complicated, but much simpler to implement once actually created, and allow for differences much more so than today, where if you don't comply with the standard, it means that your product will never survive in the market, as compared to, like, the fact that there were so many gauges that actually existed earlier in the world. So agree with you on standardization being important. Don't think it's unique to the AI issue. And I think that like a lot will have to change if any of the things we actually spoke about in this panel were to happen differently in it.
Anyone have other points to add on standards? Otherwise, Luca, you can answer the question about.
Yeah, I'll start with the David and Golia question. So I don't want to downplay, let's say, the resources that we have available. We have a great team that is working at this, also like with the technical experts. But it's true that the players that we are facing are the most powerful players that we have around, and they have almost unlimited resources in terms of lawyers, engineers that they can put to work on these cases. And also I would like to mention their power to influence the public discourse and the public policy, because they have access to a lot of firms, associations that they can leverage and they can use for influence the public discourse. On the question from Beuk, I would like to say that security and privacy are at the center of the DMA, because we consider those like to be very important values, especially for consumers, and consumers are at the center of the DMA. We are not compromising on security and privacy when we are opening up the ecosystem of the gatekeepers. We see a lot of times that gatekeepers are raising claims that and resistances to open up, and they're bringing forward justification related to security and privacy. We see that we are open for discussion, and there are ways to make sure that opening up of opportunities goes hand in hand with protecting security and privacy. And on the question on whether there are discussions and forums in which that can happen, I would say that in the consultation, as you mentioned, there was for both of them there was a public consultation in which we have received the views of all the interested parties, from consumers, businesses, associations. But also we have, as you mentioned, the high-level group, that is a forum in which we are discussing with other regulators, and security and privacy is discussed there. Specifically on privacy and protection of users' data, we had long exchanges with the EDPB and the National Data Protection Authority. We are writing guidelines together with them. We are consulting on our cases. So I would say that we have many instruments in which we can foster that dialogue.
Great. I think we have time for one more quick question before the bell rings again. So, lady over there, do you want to just yell?
And everything, is it really like, can we really speak of any privacy? Because to create that personalized experience, you need more information about the user. So how do you manage to create a sort of privacy when the purpose of that agent is to get the most data possible? Thank you.
Maybe like this is your question.
No, you should.
But the one sentence is, let's not confuse what dominant players are offering with what this theoretically could be. Theoretically, I would love to have a separate email account on a separate device where certain administrative emails go to, I get reminded. I don't want to deal with bureaucracy. So there are scenarios in which we could automate things we don't want to do, but unfortunately, that's not at all what's happening.
I'll maybe just add one super quick thing, which is, I think it's a really good question because it asks what parts of the things that we have a problem about are inherent in the nature of the technology that we are talking about. And I do think that there are many components to this technology, like especially from a security perspective, but also from a privacy one, that are unlike what have been available at a general scale so far and the day-to-day consequence of them being deployed, I think as long as the technology exists, we will only be like plugging the holes because of what the nature of this probabilistic system that will by nature make mistakes, by nature can be prompt injected, by nature wants to go wrong because that's how it learns how to go right, is really, really important.
Great. Well, I take a clear call to challenge, I think, a lot of the sort of inevitability and determinism that we see in the debate around AI and tech. So we'll wrap it up there. Just a quick piece of marketing. At Open Markets, we are working on a report on AI agents and competition that we'll be publishing in the next few months. So keep an eye out for that. And if this is something you're working on or you have thoughts on, like, feel free to reach out with me or anyone in the team. We're happy to chat about it. And other than that, I'd just like to thank the fantastic panel for a great discussion. And yeah, see you next time.